"You're blind now, Mom. You don't need to look at flowers anymore." Those words came from the mouth of the very daughter I had loved without reservation. That is where this story begins. The first time I heard the excavator was on a Monday morning, January 8th, while I was lying in a bed at Providence Portland Medical Center with both eyes wrapped in white gauze and a world of darkness spread out before me. At first, I thought I was dreaming. That sound, heavy, rhythmic, grinding something hard and wet, didn't match the acoustics of a hospital. I lay still and listened, letting my ears do the work my eyes couldn't manage in those days. An excavator. The sound of earth being turned over. The sound of something being destroyed in steady, cold, patient intervals. "Diane," I called. "Diane, do you hear something outside?" There was a small pause before my daughter spoke from the chair in the corner of the room. I knew she was there because I could hear her phone vibrating occasionally and the sound of a finger scrolling across a screen. "Oh, they're doing water main repairs in the area, Mom. It's nothing. You need to rest." I didn't believe it right away. Water main repairs don't sound like that. My eyes had been bandaged after the double cataract surgery that Dr. Renner had performed the day before, and I depended on Diane for everything, from having a glass of water placed in my hand to being guided to the bathroom. I was in no position to argue. "All right," I said. "Thank you, sweetheart." But the excavator didn't stop. It continued for 3 hours in intermittent bursts, while I lay in the dark and tried not to think about what I couldn't see. My name is Sarah Ellen Whitmore. I am 65 years old. I have grown roses for 32 years on 2.5 acres in the northeast suburbs of Portland, Oregon, a place that locals have taken to calling the Whitmore Place, because no one bothers to remember the actual street name anymore. They only need to know it's where you can see the impossibly long rows of rose bushes from a distance in the morning fog. I have won first place at the Oregon Rose Festival 5 consecutive years. I have taught more than 200 people to grow roses in weekend workshops held in the potting shed behind the house. I have sold fresh-cut flowers, bare rootstock, and growing guides to people across the Pacific Northwest through an online shop I launched 20 years ago. Back when most people barely understood what selling online meant. That garden was my life. Not in a figurative sense, in a literal, concrete one. It was where I spent every morning from 5:30 onward, walking between the rows when the night dew was still on the leaves, a small pair of pruning shears in my hand that my husband Thomas had given me for my 40th birthday. It was where my daughter grew up, breathing the smell of wet soil and rose petals, where I taught her that beauty doesn't arrive on its own. It has to be tended with patience every single day. It was where Thomas left this world. He died in 2017 on an October afternoon in Oregon, and I sat with him under the old apple tree in the far corner of the garden and held his hand until it went cold. And now, I was lying in a hospital bed with my eyes bandaged, hearing an excavator outside while my daughter stared at her phone in the corner of the room. I didn't know that this was the last moment I would be whole. Dr. Renner removed the bandages on Wednesday morning, January 10th. He told me the surgery had gone well, that my vision would remain unstable and light-sensitive for 4 to 6 weeks, that I needed to avoid bright light and not read small print. He said that under ideal recovery conditions, I could expect to regain nearly full vision by late February. "Nearly?" I asked. "We'll evaluate week by week," Dr. Renner said, in the way doctors say things when they prefer not to make precise promises. "Mrs. Whitmore, what matters most right now is not straining your eyes. Rest. No screens. Have someone read documents to you when necessary. You'll need to be looked after for at least 4 weeks." Diane was standing beside me when he said that. I heard her breathing, steady and calm. "Mom will come stay with us," she said. "I'll take care of her." us in that sentence did not mean my home, the 2.5-acre property in northeast Portland, the 3-bedroom white clapboard house that Thomas and I had bought in 1991 and slowly transformed into the heart of a rose garden. Our place meant Diane and her new husband's house, Brett Holloway, a modern house with no garden, no trees, nothing living and green except a pair of plastic plants in the corner of the living room. But I wasn't in a position to debate that. The doctor said I needed care. Diane would provide it. And my garden, I told Diane before they discharged me, needed watering every day. The drip irrigation system needed checking. Someone needed to prune back the dead wood before the winter fully set in. "Don't worry, Mom," Diane said. "I've taken care of it." The car arrived at my property a little before noon. I knew I was home, not by sight. My vision was still sensitive and blurred, not sharp enough to make out detail, but by smell. The smell of Portland earth in January, damp and cool, the smell of the bark chips that insulate the roots through winter, the smell of the air from a garden I had been breathing for 32 years. But something wasn't right. I stood beside the car and tried to look toward the garden. My eyes could only receive blurred shapes and indistinct colors, like looking through a fogged window pane. But it was enough to see. There was nothing there. No deep green of leafy rose, no waist-high silhouette of rose shrubs. The ground in front of me was flat in the way that cultivated soil is not flat, but in the way of ground that has just been graded, leveled by something heavy and mechanical. "Diane," my voice didn't come out at first. I had to swallow and try again. "Diane, where is my garden?" 1 second of silence. 2, 3. "Mom, I need to talk to you about that. Not right now. You just got out of the hospital. You need to go inside and rest. We'll talk later." "Diane." I didn't move. "Tell me now." There was a sigh. Not the sigh of guilt caught out, but the sigh of someone irritated at being pressured to explain a decision they had already determined required no explanation. "I exercised the land management authority you signed before the surgery to optimize the footprint. The store needs a larger parking lot. Customers have been complaining constantly. This was a sound business decision, Mom. That land was sitting idle." Sitting idle. 32 years. 5 first-place ribbons. 200 students. The garden that Thomas and I had built together out of a weedy lot in 1991. "Sitting idle," I repeated. "You're blind now, Mom. You don't need to look at flowers anymore." I stood still. The January wind off Portland came into my face, cold and damp and carrying the smell of rain on its way. I felt my heart beating very slowly and very heavily, as though it were working to pump something thicker than blood. And I remembered something. I had signed a piece of paper before going into surgery. I need to go back to Friday, January 5th, 3 days before the surgery, because that's when everything began. Diane came to my house that afternoon with a file folder inside a brown leather portfolio. She said these were the administrative documents required for medical support, paperwork confirming that she had the authority to make decisions related to my care in the event that I was unable to make them myself following the procedure. "This is standard procedure, Mom," she said. "The hospital requires it. In case there are complications or additional interventions needed while you're affected by the anesthesia, they need to know who can decide on your behalf." I was 65 years old, but not naive. I had lived long enough to know that not every piece of paper is what the person presenting it says it is. But I was also 65 years old and preparing for eye surgery. My mind was somewhere else, caught in the worry of whether I would regain my vision, of who would look after the garden during the weeks I couldn't manage it myself. I picked up the paper. Small print, dense text, the kind of legal language written so that the average reader won't understand it at first pass. I read the heading, Healthcare Proxy and Asset Management Authorization. Asset management. I caught that phrase. "Diane, why does a medical power of attorney document include the words asset management. Diane didn't miss a beat. That's standard language for this form, Mom. It covers managing medical bills and insurance while you can't handle them yourself. That gets classified as asset management in the broad legal sense. It's really nothing unusual. I studied the document a moment longer. My eyes at that point were already compromised. The cataracts had been blurring everything for months, which is why the surgery was necessary. And the small print on that page was a genuine challenge. I could read portions of it. Others were too unclear. "Let me read this more carefully before I sign," I said. "Let me have my attorney look it over." "Mom, surgery is Monday. Today is Friday. Your attorney needs at least a week's notice to schedule an appointment. The hospital needs this paperwork before they admit you." Diane's voice carried just enough urgency to not quite sound like pressure, but enough to create it. "If you don't sign, they may refuse to take you as scheduled. Do you want to delay another 3 months?" 3 months. I had already been waiting 6 months for this surgery. 6 months of watching the world grow blurrier by the day, unable to distinguish the colors of the roses in my own garden, unable to read the instructions on fertilizer packets, unable to see the faces of my students clearly in the weekend workshops. I could not wait another 3 months. I signed. That is the decision I will regret most deeply for the rest of my life. Not because I trusted Diane, but because I didn't trust myself enough to refuse and find another way. Not because I was weak, but because I was afraid. And people never sign well when they are afraid. I would understand what I had signed a few weeks later when my vision began to recover. And that is when this story truly starts. My house, the property in northeast Portland, had 3 bedrooms and a storage room at the back, near where the old potting shed used to stand. I used that room to store seed stock, fertilizer, small garden tools, and the cardboard boxes holding the rose-growing guides I had self-published. No windows, no heat. The only light was a single overhead bulb on a pull cord. That is where Diane put me on the afternoon of Thursday, January 11th, one day after I had come home and stood before the graded earth that 32 years ago had been a rose garden. "I need the main bedroom as a display room for the store's samples," Diane explained when I said nothing. "The smaller bedroom will be the office. This room..." She paused, looking around the storage room the way a person looks at something they've already filed under, handled. "Has enough space for you. It's better for you to be close to familiar things." I looked at the windowless room, a folding cot leaning against the wall, the smell of organic fertilizer and old soil, the sound of a pipe running through the ceiling somewhere above. "You're blind now," Diane said, and this time her voice was so matter-of-fact that the words landed heavier than any deliberate cruelty would have. "You don't need to look at flowers anymore." I wanted to say so many things. I wanted to ask about 32 years, about the early mornings, about the 5 first-place ribbons, about Thomas and the old apple tree in the far corner. I wanted to ask Diane if she remembered the day she was 7 years old and ran into the garden after a rainstorm, slipped in the mud and cried, and I had sat down beside her in the mud and held her without caring about our clothes, and she had asked why roses need thorns, and I had said, "Because the most beautiful things still need to be able to protect themselves." I wanted to say all of that, but I said nothing. I walked into the storage room, sat on the edge of the folding cot, let Diane close the door behind me from the outside. And in the darkness of that windowless room, with the smell of fertilizer and the sound of the pipes, I sat quietly and began to think. Not thinking in the way of panic, not thinking in the way of rage, but thinking in the way that 32 years of growing roses had taught me. Patiently, methodically, now one step at a time. A rose doesn't bloom because someone prays for it. It blooms because someone pruned it properly, fed it at the right dose, watered it enough but not too much. Good outcomes don't come from strong emotions. They come from work done correctly and consistently. My problem was a legal one. The solution also had to be legal. The question was, did I have enough to stand firm in that kind of fight? I didn't know the answer that night, but I started from the only point I was certain of. I needed to know what I had signed. Part 2, Memory in Reverse, 32 years, and who I had been. To understand why that garden meant more to me than a piece of property, you need to know who I was before it became a garden. I was born in Medford, Oregon in 1959, the second of 4 children in a farming family. My father grew pears, the famous Comis variety of the Rogue River Valley, and my mother was an elementary school teacher. We weren't wealthy, but we didn't go without, and the most important thing that household taught me was the value of making something with your own hands and caring about it. I studied plant biology at Oregon State University, graduated in 1981, and met Thomas Whitmore in my final year. He was studying landscape architecture, and we met in a shared elective on urban green space design. Thomas wasn't conventionally handsome, but he had skilled hands and the attentive look of someone who genuinely listens when you're speaking. 2 things I had always thought mattered more than a face. We married in 1984 in Medford, in my parents' backyard, under the pear trees in bloom. Thomas worked as a landscape architect for a Portland firm. I spent 3 years doing research at the Oregon State Agricultural Extension, then transitioned to teaching. Diane was born in 1988. We rented in Portland for 7 years, saving every dollar, before we were able to buy the Northeast Portland property in 1991. When we bought it, the land was overgrown with weeds and scrub brush, and the old wood house needed paint badly. But the soil was good. Thomas tested it before we signed and confirmed it was ideal alluvial loam for growing things. And I had looked at those 2.5 weedy acres and seen long rows of roses stretching out in my mind. I want to plant roses, I told Thomas the first time we stood together in the middle of all that overgrowth. Then plant roses, he said, the way he said most things, simply. In the spring of 1992, I planted the first bushes, 40 plants, all hybrid tea varieties I had ordered from a nursery in California. Thomas built the irrigation system. We worked weekends and evenings after our day jobs, both of us filthy with soil and tired and satisfied in the way that only comes from building something that is truly yours. In the spring of 1993, all 40 rose bushes bloomed for the first time. I stood in the middle of the garden on the morning that happened and cried. Not crying from being overwhelmed in a dramatic sense, but crying in the way you cry when you see the results of 1.5 years of patient work become real. The kind of crying that is equal parts tenderness and resolve. Thomas stood behind me and put his hand on my shoulder. Add another 40 next year? He asked. 100, I said. That's how we built the garden. Diane Eleanor Whitmore was born on August 15th, 1988, at 3:30 in the afternoon, while outside Portland was having one of those gentle summer rains that Oregon summers do. I remember that detail because Thomas stood beside the hospital bed, looking out the window at the rain, and said, "August rain in Portland. She'll love rain her whole life." Diane didn't love rain. That was clear early on. Even as a small child, she was the kind of kid who didn't like getting her hands dirty, didn't like sitting on wet grass, didn't like the smell of earth after a storm that both Thomas and I considered the finest smell in the world. She liked indoors, liked screens, liked things that were flat and clean and controllable. I didn't see that as a problem. People don't need to be copies of their parents. Thomas and I always believed that. We never wanted Diane to grow roses because we grew roses. We wanted her to find her own thing. What Diane found was fashion. By age 15, she was sewing her own clothes, designing accessories from fabric scraps that Thomas bought at thrift stores. She studied fashion design at the College of Design, Art and Architecture in Portland, graduated with honors and a portfolio that both Thomas and I were genuinely proud of. I need to say this honestly. Diane was not a bad person from the beginning. She is not the villain in this story in the simple sense people often reach for when they want to judge someone. She was a good person, up until some point, through a chain of decisions made for reasons I understand, even if I don't agree with them. She began making choices that were wrong in ways that became gradually, irreversibly worse. That chain began when Thomas died. Thomas died in September 2017, after a stroke that hit him in his office in the middle of a workday. Sudden and without warning, he collapsed. A colleague called 911. The ambulance came, and Thomas never regained consciousness. I arrived at the hospital in time to hold his hand while it was still warm, and I sat with him until it went cold. After Thomas died, I did what I knew how to do. I went to the garden. Every morning at 5:30, I was outside, and the work of soil and plants and creation kept me going in a way that nothing else could in that period. Diane did what she knew how to do. She began thinking about money. Not immediately, and not entirely consciously. I don't want to paint a picture simpler than reality. But after Thomas died, Diane began asking questions she hadn't asked before. About Thomas's will, about the value of the land, about the savings. She started visiting me more often, which I was glad of. But each visit included small questions woven into the conversation in ways that weren't easy to catch. Have you thought about selling some of the extra land, Mom? Northeast Portland real estate is priced very high right now. Do you want me to help manage your finances so you don't have to worry? That garden is a lot of work. Maybe you should scale back? At the time, I didn't hear the thread of meaning running through those questions. I heard a daughter worried about her widowed mother living alone on a large piece of property. That was my misreading, and I take responsibility for it. Brett Holloway entered Diane's life, and therefore mine, in 2019, about 2 years after Thomas died. Brett sold commercial real estate, was born in Sacramento, went to college in Arizona, and had never lived anywhere longer than 3 years up to the point I met him. I did not like Brett Holloway from the first meeting. Not because he was impolite. He was very polite, in the way that's been carefully learned and deployed at the right moment. Not because he wasn't intelligent. He was intelligent about money and negotiation in the way that commercial real estate requires you to be. But he was a man who didn't care about anything that couldn't be expressed in dollars, and I had lived on land long enough to know that type of person tends not to see a garden as a garden. They see square footage that hasn't been developed yet. Diane and Brett married in 2020 during the pandemic, in a small ceremony with 15 guests. I attended and offered my genuine good wishes. I wanted Diane to be happy, regardless of who brought her that happiness. But throughout the ceremony, I noticed that every time Brett used the word future, that word came packaged with numbers and rates of return. After the wedding, Diane opened her fashion boutique, Diane's Collection, in a leased space in the Pearl District. Brett contributed the startup capital. The store struggled from the start. The Pearl District is expensive, overhead was high, and Diane had design talent, but no experience running a retail operation. And that was when my property and my rose garden began appearing in conversations between Diane and Brett. I know this not because I overheard them discussing it, and I know it because Carmen Reyes, the neighbor who has lived next door to me for 15 years, stood at the fence between our properties one November afternoon in 2020 and said, "Sarah, last week I heard Brett on the phone while he was standing in Diane's backyard. He was talking about Mrs. Whitmore's footprint and relocating the store. I'm not sure exactly what he meant, but I thought you should know." I thanked Carmen and said nothing more to her about it. But I started paying closer attention. 4 months after that conversation, my cataracts had worsened to the point where I could no longer put off surgery. And Diane, my daughter, the girl I had held in my arms on a rainy August afternoon in 1988 and silently promised that I would give her everything she needed to live well, came to my house with a file folder inside a brown leather portfolio. I want to say more about Thomas, because he is present in this story far more than I've indicated. Not as a character who appears in the action scenes, but as the person who built the foundation for everything I have been able to stand on since he left. Thomas Whitmore was a landscape architect, but in practice, he was a person who understood how things connect. Not just plants to soil, but people to space, memory to place, the present moment to what came before and what comes after. He designed green spaces for the city of Portland for 20 years, and every project he handled bore the mark of that belief. Space is not an emptiness to be filled, but something that needs to be designed to breathe. He brought that view to our garden. Not in the sense that he treated it like a professional project, but in the sense that he understood a good garden needs empty spaces in the right places, just as much as it needs plants in the right places. Whenever I wanted to plant more, Thomas was the one who'd say, "Hold on, Sarah. This open stretch is breathing well. Don't rush to fill it." Sometimes I argued, sometimes he was right. There was one thing Thomas did that I only grasped the full meaning of after he died. He kept notebooks. Not journals about work or gardening, but records of conversations, of moments, of small observations from daily life. He had a series of small green notebooks written in black ink with small neat handwriting, full of notes about things most people don't think of as important. After Thomas died, I found 37 green notebooks in the drawer of his desk. I read through every one of them, slowly, and over the winter following his death. And in those notebooks, I found what Thomas had never said directly to me. He expressed feeling through writing, not through speaking, and I had known that about him throughout our marriage. But I hadn't known he had written about me so much. One passage I carry always, from the 17th notebook, written in the summer of 2010. Sarah went out to the garden at 5:30 this morning, same as always. I watched her through the kitchen window and thought that the way she walks between the rows, slow, attentive, her hand occasionally brushing a petal or a leaf, that is how a person ought to move through their own life. No hurry. Nothing skipped over. Everything seen. I read that passage and cried for the first time since the funeral. Not from sadness, but from the feeling of being fully seen, and in the deepest sense, by the person who mattered most, in an ordinary moment I hadn't known he was observing. The 37 green notebooks are in the drawer of my desk now. They are the true legacy Thomas left behind. Not the house, not money, but evidence that a man had paid attention to his life and his wife's life for 40 years and found value in the most ordinary things. No one can take those notebooks. No one knows they're there but me. There is something I haven't yet told you. My vision began recovering much sooner than Dr. Renner had predicted. By the 10th day after surgery, Wednesday, January 17th, I could clearly make out shapes and large text. By day 12, Friday, January 19th, I could read medium-sized print in good light. Not completely. There was still some blurring at the edges of my visual field, still sensitivity to bright light, but enough to read, enough to observe. I didn't tell Diane. This was a conscious decision, thought through over many nights lying in the dark storage room. I understood that I was in a situation where information was power. If Diane knew my vision had come back, she would adjust her behavior, become more careful, more guarded. But if she believed I was still blind or nearly so, she wouldn't be careful. And I needed to see what happened when people weren't being careful. This didn't sit easily with me. I am not someone accustomed to pretending or calculating. Thomas used to say I was so straightforward, I was like a tree, no give to me. But this was not the moment to be a straight tree. This was the moment I needed to learn to hold my roots steady while I waited for the right season. So I kept the pretense going. I used my cane the way someone who needs a cane uses it. I asked others to read things aloud that I could have read myself. I sat where a person with poor vision would sit, away from windows, close to the lamp, and I watched. The first thing I observed was how Diane and Brett were using my house. The main bedroom had been turned into a clothing display room. I could see through the gap in the door when I walked past. The smaller bedroom was an office with computer screens and stacks of documents. The living room was where Diane received customers who came by appointment to look at merchandise. The second thing I observed was the contract. On the morning of Friday, January 19th, when Diane had gone out and Brett was in the upstairs office, I left the storage room and walked to the office. I knew where Diane's file folder was. In the second drawer on the left. I had noted the position when she pulled it out in front of me. I found the copy of the document I had signed on January 5th. I placed it under the desk lamp and read it. The first read required patience because of the dense legal language, and partly because my vision wasn't fully steady yet. By the second reading, I understood enough to feel the blood go cold in my body. That document was not simply a medical power of attorney. It was a property management and disposition authorization, including real estate, in the event that the signer was incapable of making sound decisions due to a medical condition. That clause, incapable of making sound decisions, was defined in the document in very broad terms, including serious visual impairment affecting the ability to read and process written information. Serious visual impairment. That clause had been written into the document deliberately, designed to activate the moment I left the operating room with bandaged eyes. And under that clause, the authorized agent, Diane Eleanor Whitmore Holloway, had the right to make management and preservation decisions regarding real estate at the agent's best judgment for the benefit of the grantor. Leveling a rose garden to create a parking lot for a fashion boutique. That was Diane's best judgment, and for the benefit of the grantor according to those terms. I stood in that office for a while, document in hand, reading the words on the page. Then I put the document back in exactly the right place, left the office, and returned to the storage room. I sat on the edge of the folding cot and looked at the wall in front of me. I asked myself, what is the next step? The answer came without much difficulty, because 30 years of growing roses had taught me a rule. When you discover your plant has been infested, you don't panic and cut every branch. You identify exactly where the problem is, you understand how it moves, and you act precisely at the right moment. I needed evidence. I needed an attorney. And I needed someone to know I was here and that I was all right. This is where I need to tell you about the second secret, something I haven't mentioned yet, which will become clearer as we go. Before the surgery, I had had a brief conversation with Carmen Reyes, my neighbor, at the fence between our properties. Carmen knew about my concerns regarding Brett, because she was the one who had warned me the previous year. In that conversation, Carmen had given me an old small phone, a simple push-button cell phone, not a smartphone. If you ever need to call someone and don't want to use your main phone, use this one, she said. I put $30 of minutes on it. I've got my number saved in there. I accepted the phone and tucked it into the pocket of an old wool sweater before going in for the procedure. When Diane moved my things from the car to the storage room, I kept that sweater in my hands. Not because I was cold, but because the small phone in the pocket was the only thing I truly needed to hold on to. On the Friday night after I had read the document, when the house had gone quiet and Diane and Brett had retired to their bedroom, I took out the small phone and called Carmen. "Are you all right?" Carmen's voice came immediately when she heard mine. "I'm all right," I said. Carmen, I need to ask you something. Could you come to the house on Monday morning and bring your phone camera? What do you need photographed? Evidence, I said. And I need you to find me an attorney who specializes in civil law and property disputes in Portland. Not anyone Diane knows. There was a brief pause. Then Carmen said, There's someone I know. Margaret Chen. She went to Reed College with my son. She's a lawyer now. Very good. Thank you. And Carmen, don't tell anyone about this. Not yet. I understand, Carmen said. Monday, January 20th, when Diane had gone out to meet a fabric supplier and Brett was in an online meeting in the upstairs office, Carmen Reyes came to my house through the back door, which I had unlocked beforehand. We worked for 1 hour. Carmen photographed the authorization document with her phone, clear shots of every page, every clause. She photographed the new parking lot, the place that 32 years ago had been a rose garden. She photographed the storage room where I was staying with the folding cot and the garden tools and the pull cord bulb. I didn't let Carmen know my vision had recovered. Not because I didn't trust her, I trusted her completely, but because a secret is only as safe as the smallest number of people who know it. After Carmen left, I sat in the storage room and started writing. Not on the phone, by hand, on sheets of paper I pulled from the cardboard boxes of my old books. I wrote down every event in chronological order: January 5th, the document, Diane's explanation, my signing. January 8th, the excavator. January 10th, coming home, the rose garden gone. What Diane said. The storage room, and the document I reread on the 19th. Here is what 30 years of growing roses had taught me about record keeping. You don't record things to remember them. You record them to prove them. And when you need to prove something before a judge, what you need isn't memory. It's dates and events written down with enough detail that no one can credibly dispute them. I wrote 9 pages over those 2 days. I put them in a brown envelope and hid it inside an old seed tin in the corner of the storage room, a tin in which I labeled each variety according to my own private notation system that Diane had never understood or cared about. I thought about Thomas. If he were here, he would be sitting beside me in this storage room, saying something that was gentle and practical at the same time. He always had the ability to do both things simultaneously in a way I never quite learned. I don't know what he would have said, but I know he would not have told me to give up. He wasn't that kind of person, and he never wanted me to be that kind of person. Build it to last wasn't Thomas's phrase. That belonged to old Patrick Callahan in another story from Chicago. But Thomas had his own version. Sarah, a rose, doesn't fear winter. It knows spring is coming. I held on to that. Margaret Chen was a 38-year-old attorney with a small office near the Morrison Bridge in Portland. Carmen had set up the meeting. She told Margaret that a friend needed urgent advice and needed to come in person rather than over the phone. Wednesday, January 22nd. I left the house in the morning after Diane had gone to work. I used my cane, not because I needed it anymore, but out of habit. I took the bus to the Morrison Bridge and walked into the building where Margaret Chen's office was located. Margaret Chen was small, with straight black hair, thin wire-frame glasses, and the attentive look of someone who has heard a great many stories and is still genuinely listening. When I finished my account, including the document, the rose garden, the storage room, and what Diane had said, she sat quietly for a moment before speaking. You're still carrying your cane, but you just took the bus here on your own and read the room number on the door before knocking. I stopped, looked at Margaret Chen. I noticed from the beginning, she said gently, but that doesn't change what you need to do. In fact, it may actually help. I set the cane down. This was the first time in 14 days I had done that in front of anyone. I need help, I said directly. Can you help me? I believe so, Margaret Chen said, but I need you to go through every detail again while I take notes. And I need to see photos of the documents you mentioned. We sat for 2 hours. I went through everything again. Margaret Chen took notes and asked questions. Questions focused on dates, on exact wording, on details I thought were minor but she considered significant. When I finished, she studied her notes for a moment. You signed that document under conditions of insufficient information. The document did not explain the scope of asset management clearly, and it contained no clause protecting the landowner's right of use and enjoyment during the grantor's lifetime. Margaret Chen paused. More importantly, the act of leveling the rose garden was not an act of preserving the asset or acting for the benefit of the grantor. It was an act in service of a third party's commercial interest. This is a breach of fiduciary duty, and it can be voided. Can be voided? With sufficient evidence of bad faith at the time of signing, and from what you've described about how the document was presented, about the timing that was chosen, I think we have legal grounds. Not certainty, but enough to proceed. She looked me straight in the eye. Do you want to proceed? I want my land back, I said, and I want my daughter to not be able to do this to anyone else ever again. Margaret Chen nodded. All right. We start by gathering evidence systematically. This is where I need to reveal the third thing I had been holding back, the thing you may have been wondering about throughout this story. 3 weeks before Diane came to my house with the file folder, before the surgery, I had done something I didn't tell anyone. I had taken the most prized rootstock from my collection. 23 plants from prize-winning rose varieties, including 3 cultivars that I had spent 10 years developing through hybridization and that existed only in my garden. And I had carefully packaged them and given them to someone. That person was James Okafor. James Okafor was a former student of mine. He had come to my weekend rose-growing class 12 years ago when he was 25 years old and had just bought a small piece of land in Hillsborough. He was the only one among my 200 students who, after the course ended, had stayed and kept learning, not in the classroom, but by working alongside me in the garden on weekend afternoons, asking his own questions, running his own experiments, and gradually becoming someone who understood roses almost as well as I did. I didn't explain to James why I was giving him those plants. I only said, James, I need to ask you to keep these safe for me for a while. No charge. Can you do that? James looked at the small containers, looked at me, then said, Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. I'll treat them like my own children. At the moment that the excavator was leveling my rose garden in northeast Portland, my 23 most precious rose plants were sitting in James Okafor's garden in Hillsborough, being tended by the only person I trusted to care for them properly. The seed stock was safe. The garden could be rebuilt. Margaret Chen worked quickly and carefully. Over 2 weeks from late January to early February, she gathered and prepared the following. First, a comparative analysis of the authorization I had signed against Oregon's standard medical proxy forms, identifying that Diane's document contained real estate clauses not present in the standard form and not explained to the person signing. Second, a sworn declaration from Dr. Renner confirming that my visual condition at the time of signing had been sufficient to impair my ability to read small print legal text, and that he had not been informed the document included real estate provisions. Third, photographs of the document, photographs of the new parking lot, photographs of the storage room, and my 9 handwritten pages, chronicling the sequence of events from January 5th through the 22nd. Fourth, and most critically, Carmen Reyes agreed to testify about the conversation she had overheard the previous year, when Brett Holloway stood in Diane's backyard speaking on the phone about Mrs. Whitmore's footprint and relocating the store. That established that the plan had been in place before my surgery. On February 12th, Margaret Chen served legal notice on Diane Eleanor Whitmore Holloway and Brett Holloway. demanding the authorization be voided on the grounds that it had been signed without sufficient information being provided and without full capacity to review legal documents, demanding compensation for property damage caused without the valid consent of the owner, demanding that I be immediately restored to full use of the house and land. And I sat in the storage room that evening, the last night I would sleep in that windowless room. And for the first time in many weeks, the air in there did not feel like the air of a cell. It was just a storage room. Tomorrow would be different. Diane's first reaction when she received the legal notice was anger. Not the anger of guilt discovered, but the anger of someone who believes they are in the right and cannot accept that anyone would dare push back. She came down to the storage room, opened the door without knocking, which I had grown used to, and stood in the doorway with the legal notice in her hand. "You hired an attorney." I sat on the folding cot and looked at her. No cane. Eyes level. "Yes," I said. "You can see?" Diane's voice changed. The anger drained out of it and something else took its place, something that took me a second to identify as genuine surprise. "For several days now," I said. There was a long pause. Diane looked at me the way a person looks when they're recalculating a sequence of events with new information. I looked back at her, and for the first time in many weeks, I was not hiding anything. "What you did was wrong," I said. Not a question, not an accusation delivered in anger, just truth spoken plainly. "You know it was wrong, and now you're going to face the consequences of it through the legal system. I didn't want this, but I had no other choice." "Brett says we have a better attorney," Diane said, but the certainty had left her voice. "That may be true," I said. "But a good attorney also needs truth to stand on, and the truth in this case does not favor you." The civil hearing at Multnomah County Circuit Court took place on March 17th. Not a criminal proceeding. Margaret Chen and I had not pursued criminal charges because my goal was not to imprison Diane. My goal was to recover what was mine and establish clear legal boundaries. The ruling. The January 5th authorization was voided because the real estate clauses had not been adequately explained, and the signer had lacked the capacity to properly review legal documents at the time of signing. All actions taken under that authorization, including the leveling of the rose garden and the use of the property for commercial activity, were declared void. Diane and Brett Holloway were required to vacate the property within 30 days and to compensate for the destruction of the plantings. I sat in the courtroom while the judge read the ruling, and I did not cry. Not because I wasn't moved. I was profoundly moved. But that feeling was not the kind that needs tears. It was quiet and deep, the way you feel when you see the first rose bloom after a long winter. You don't shout or jump. You just stand there and breathe. After the hearing, Diane came to me in the hallway. Brett was not there. He had left earlier, according to what Carmen told me afterward. Diane stood in front of me, dressed as neatly as ever, but with reddened eyes in the way of someone who has not been crying. "Mom," she began. "Diane," I said, and my voice was calmer than I expected to be able to manage in that moment. "I love you. That doesn't change. But it doesn't mean I will pretend that what happened is nothing. What you did and what Brett did didn't come from a momentary lapse. It came from a deliberate plan. You know that, and I know that." Diane said nothing. "I don't want you in prison," I continued. "I don't want to destroy your life more than what has already happened. But I need you to understand that there are things that can't be made right with an apology and can't be erased by time. Those rose rows represented 32 years and my marriage and your father. When you leveled them, without asking me, without explaining, and said, 'You're blind now, you don't need to look at flowers,' that was not only a legal wrong. That was what you did to the relationship between us." Diane looked down. "I'm sorry." "I hear that," I said, but an apology needs time to become something real. Right now, you need to move your things and arrange your life. And I need to start rebuilding what was lost. That was the last conversation we had for many months. Diane and Brett moved out within 2 weeks, ahead of the 30-day deadline. Diane's collection closed 3 weeks after that, according to what I heard from Carmen. In our first meeting, Margaret Chen asked me a question I have never forgotten because it made me rethink a great many things. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said after hearing my full account, "I need to ask a difficult question. Did you know, on some level, that something was wrong with that document before you signed it?" I sat quietly for a moment. That question was genuinely hard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the honest answer required me to look at myself in a way that wasn't comfortable. "I noticed the phrase, asset management," I said finally, "and I asked about it." Diane gave an explanation, and I wasn't completely convinced, but I signed anyway. Why? Because I was afraid of delaying the surgery, and because I didn't want to believe that my own daughter could... I didn't finish the sentence. Margaret Chen didn't need to hear the rest. "This is important to your case," she said, her voice direct but not judgmental. "You knew something was off, but you didn't act on it for 2 interlocked reasons: medical fear and the refusal to acknowledge an uncomfortable truth about someone close to you. Those 2 reasons, combined with the way the document was presented, rushed, no time for independent review, timed when you were in a vulnerable state, constitute what the law calls signing under duress in conditions of insufficient disclosure. That can protect you legally." "But I still signed?" "You did," Margaret Chen said, "and that means you carry some responsibility for placing yourself in that situation without adequate protection. Not responsibility for Diane's conduct, but for the fact that you walked in without enough safeguards. That doesn't diminish Diane's legal liability, but it means you need to genuinely learn from this, not just as someone who was wronged." I heard that and didn't get defensive. I had already been sitting with that question. In those nights in the storage room, I had asked myself, where did I go wrong? And this was part of the answer. I had known and chosen not to look because I didn't want to see. That wasn't entirely my fault. Diane and Brett had exploited it deliberately, but I wasn't entirely blameless either. "Thank you for being direct," I said to Margaret Chen, and I meant it. On a Saturday morning in early April, James Okafor drove his small pickup truck to my house at 9 o'clock. In the bed of the truck were 23 rose plants, carefully packed in small ventilated containers, each one labeled according to the notation system he had learned from me. I stood at the door, watching James unload the containers, and didn't speak for a moment. Those plants, through 3 months of Oregon winter in Hillsboro, tended by the student I trusted more than anyone in the craft, looked healthy and strong. Leaves a deep sound green, roots pressing against the containers in the way of plants that are ready to go into open ground. "Mrs. Whitmore," James said when he set down the last container and straightened up, "I also brought 12 more plants from my own garden, varieties you taught me that I've been propagating over the past 5 years. I want to give them to you." I looked at him. James Okafor, 37 years old, hands already showing the calluses of a real grower, blue flannel shirt, and mud-caked work boots. My student from 12 years ago, the one who had stayed and learned for real. "Thank you," I said. And for the first time in many months, I cried. Not much, just a few seconds. Then I stopped because there was work to do. We got to work. James, Carmen, and her husband, Eduardo, and 2 friends James had brought along. 6 people on an April morning in Portland, with thin sunshine and the damp air of soil just past its winter. They turned the earth, added compost, dug the holes, set the plants. I directed each placement, not because I couldn't do it alone, but because I wanted them doing it with me, the way the garden had always been best when more than one person was caring for it. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 35 plants had gone into the ground, not enough to fill 2.5 acres immediately, but enough to begin. The soil was the fresh, dark brown of newly turned earth, the small stems standing straight and reaching up in the afternoon light. I stood in the middle of the garden that was beginning to come back and looked around. The land before me didn't look like it had 32 years ago. It was smaller in scale, younger, not yet full. But it was real soil, and real plants, and a real beginning. The remaining portion where the asphalt parking lot had been, in the west corner, I decided to leave it, since Margaret Chen had advised me that it was sufficient area to use in other ways later on. "What are you thinking for that corner?" James asked when we stood looking toward the paved section. I had been thinking about the answer to that question for weeks. "A small cafe," I said. "Rose garden cafe. People can sit with their coffee in the middle of the rose garden. I can keep teaching the growing classes. And sell bare root stock the way I used to." James looked at me, then at the paved corner. "Need help building it?" "Yes," I said. That April morning wasn't only the 6 of us. There were 2 more people I need to mention, because their being there meant something particular. The first was Patricia Okonkwo, one of my former weekend class students, a Nigerian-born woman who had moved to Portland in 2005 and joined my Rose class in 2009. Patricia was not the most technically skilled of my 200 students. Her hands were not precise in the technical sense, and she tended to overwater until I taught her how to check soil moisture properly. But Patricia was the most persistent. She came to class for 2 full years, asked the same questions multiple times, and wasn't embarrassed to have things repeated until she truly understood. Patricia arrived that morning with a small cart loaded with rose plants. 15 plants, an all knockout rose variety that I had taught her to grow and that she had propagated in her own garden in Beaverton. "You taught me to grow these," she said, setting them down in front of me. "Now, I'm bringing them back so you can grow them again." The second was a 15-year-old boy named Micah, Eduardo's nephew. Micah showed up with his own small shovel and spent the whole morning digging holes under James's direction, diligent and quiet and thorough in the way that is rare at 15. When we stopped for lunch, Micah sat beside me and asked, "Mrs. Sarah, how long does it take for roses to bloom the first time?" I looked at the boy and thought of 7-year-old Diane slipping in the mud and asking why roses have thorns. "Depends on the variety," I said. "Usually 6 to 12 weeks after the first planting, if care is done right. But the most beautiful bloom is usually the 2nd year." "The 2nd year?" Micah looked slightly disappointed. "The 1st year is the year the plant puts down roots," I explained. "The 1st year the plant is learning its piece of land, learning how this particular soil holds water, learning which direction the sun comes from, learning where the roots need to go. Once the plant knows its land, then it blooms. And it blooms in its true way, not in the anxious way of a new plant trying to survive." Micah was quiet for a moment, looking at the small newly planted stems. "That sounds like people," he said. I looked at this 15-year-old saying the smartest thing I'd heard all day. "It does," I said. "It sounds a lot like people. I want to talk about the people who were beside me through that period. Not because their stories are more important than mine, but because this story would not have the ending it has without them. Carmen Reyes had known, long before I knew, that something wasn't right. She had told me about Brett's phone call the previous year. She had given me the small phone before I went in for surgery. She had photographed the evidence. She had contacted Margaret Chen. She had done all of that not because she was a hero in the dramatic sense, but because she was a good neighbor in the simplest, most old-fashioned sense of the phrase. A person who sees something wrong and doesn't look away. James Okafor had kept my most precious rose plants through 3 months of winter, tended them properly, and never asked why I needed him to do that. Oh, when I called him back and explained everything, he simply said, I knew Mrs. Whitmore had a good reason. When do you need the plants back? And Margaret Chen had believed me from the very first meeting, not because I had perfect evidence, but because she looked at a 65-year-old woman who had taken the bus to her office with a cane she didn't need anymore, and said plainly, "I need help." And she saw enough to keep going. I think about Thomas a great deal in these days, not with sadness, but with understanding. I understand now that Thomas had been preparing me for decades in a way he never explained through words, but through the way he lived. That what a person truly builds is not property or reputation or recognition. It is the right relationships, with land, with plants, with people, and with oneself. A rose doesn't fear winter. It knows spring is coming. That was Thomas's. And it was true. The Rose Garden Cafe opened on Saturday, September 15th, exactly 8 months after the morning I stood before the leveled earth and heard Diane say, "You're blind now. You don't need to look at flowers anymore." 8 months is not a long time to rebuild 32 years. The garden in September was not yet as full as it had once been. The rows were still low. We'd managed to plant a total of 68 plants across several rounds. Portions of the land were still waiting for future plantings. But the first roses, the 35 plants from the April morning, had managed to bloom their first flowers. 80 people came to the opening. Not because I advertised widely, I didn't. People came because Carmen told the neighbors told their friends of my old students told each other. James came with his wife and 2 children. Margaret Chen came and brought a bouquet from a florist near Morrison Bridge. Purple roses, not the varieties I grow, but beautiful in their own way. Dr. Renner came and said this was the best visual recovery outcome he had seen all year. I stood in the middle of the garden that afternoon and looked around. People carrying coffee cups strolled between the rows of plants. Children sat on the lawn mat that James and Eduardo had laid down in the outdoor activity area. A young woman stood in front of a rose bush, taking a photo with her phone. An older man bent down to smell a yellow rose and closed his eyes for a moment. This wasn't dinner at a fine restaurant. Not an event with reporters and professional photography. No one delivered a speech about the strength of women or an inspiring story. Just people sitting in a rose garden on a September afternoon in Portland, drinking coffee and talking and occasionally bending down to smell a flower. That was enough. That was exactly what I wanted. I need to say more about Diane, not because this story needs a clean and obvious resolution to our relationship, but because the truth is, I don't know how that story ends. 6 weeks after Diane and Brett moved out, I received a letter. Not from her attorney. It was a handwritten letter in Diane's handwriting, which I recognized instantly because I had watched her learn to write when she was small. The letter wasn't long. Diane wrote that she and Brett had separated, that she was looking for a smaller space to continue doing fashion design in a different direction, that she was seeing a therapist, and that she knew an apology wasn't sufficient, that she wasn't asking me to forgive her or resume contact. She only wanted me to know that she was trying to understand what she had done. I read that letter twice. Then I set it on the table and looked out through the kitchen window at the garden. Small rows of plants growing slowly in the morning light. And I thought about a question without a simple answer. Do I forgive Diane? The honest answer is, I don't know. And that is the most truthful answer I can give. I love my daughter. That hasn't changed. But I also know that love is not a magic wand that erases things that were consciously chosen over a sustained period of time. Diane didn't make a mistake in one weak moment. She executed a plan across several stages with Brett Holloway's involvement and her own knowing silence throughout. Forgiveness, if it comes, will come on its own time, not according to a deadline set from the outside. I am not in a position to say whether this story ends well or not in that sense. It is still continuing. What I do know is, I wrote back to Diane. briefly, 3 paragraphs. I said I had received her letter, that I was glad she was trying, that I would leave a door open, not a door anyone can walk through today, but a door she can knock on when she is ready, and I am ready. That is all I can do right now. Sometimes all is enough. There are things I have never said to Diane, not because the opportunity didn't come, but because some things a person holds not out of secrecy, but because they belong to one's inner life and don't need to be shared to be true. The first thing, I remember the day Diane was born with the precision of someone who photographs moments in memory. 3:31 in the afternoon, light rain outside the hospital window, Thomas standing looking at the rain saying, "She'll love rain her whole life." I held Diane for the first time and looked at her tiny face, red and wrinkled and seeming indignant in the way of newborns, introduced into a world that never asked their opinion. And I made her a silent promise, that I would give her a safe place to grow up and become whoever she wanted to be. That promise I have kept, and what has happened does not erase it. It only changes the shape of how I continue to keep it. The second thing, I understand why Diane did what she did, not in the sense of excusing or defending it, but in the sense of genuinely trying to understand. She witnessed Thomas's sudden, unannounced death. She had married Brett Holloway, a man whose influence on her decisions was greater than I had recognized. She had opened a store in a difficult market and watched it fail to meet expectations. Those pressures did not create the wrongdoing, but they were the soil into which the wrongdoing was planted, and I had not been attentive enough to see that soil being prepared. The third thing, and the hardest to say, I was wrong not to have spoken plainly with Diane about money and about my concerns after Thomas died. A widowed mother living alone on a large property with no clear plan for how it would be managed going forward. That was a gap I left open. And Brett Holloway saw that gap before I did. If I had sat down with Diane earlier and clearly stated what I was thinking about the garden, about my will, about my concerns, the story might have been different. Might have been, not certainly, but might. I say this not to excuse what Diane did, but to be honest about the part I played in creating that situation, the part of silence, of avoiding difficult conversations, of believing that love would be enough to let everything fall naturally into place without having to say the hard things directly. Love needs to be paired with truth. That is the lesson I have learned this year, and I am trying to teach it to myself again, every day. In October, I took up my old routine again. 5:30 in the morning, before sunrise, I go out to the garden. October fog in Oregon is thick and cold in a way that's particular to here. Not quite fog, but small water droplets suspended in the air until the streetlights become soft halos and everything takes on the blue-gray color of the pre-dawn. I put on Thomas's navy wool sweater, the one he wore on weekend mornings when he came out to the garden, and my tall work boots, and I walked out through the back door. I was holding the small pruning shears, the ones Thomas had given me for my 40th birthday, the ones I had carried for 25 years and locked away safely before going into the hospital because I had known what was coming. And I walked between the rows. October roses don't bloom. This is the season when they begin to prepare for winter. The canes are gradually hardening, leaves beginning to yellow at the edges, the last flowers of the season, if any remain, small and intensely fragrant in the way of things pushing to bloom before the cold comes. I pruned. Not much. October is not the time for aggressive pruning. Only the small damaged canes, the dry tips that need clearing so the plant can focus its energy on preparing for dormancy. The work was intricate and familiar enough that my hands moved almost on their own while my mind was somewhere else. I thought about what I had learned in these 8 months. Not lessons in the way people tend to present them at the end of a story, a numbered list of insights, but specific things, truly soil dirty in the literal sense. I learned that trust is necessary, but not something you extend without observation. I had trusted Diane in the way a mother trusts a child, unconditionally and without noticing the small signs. Carmen had seen those signs. I hadn't wanted to. That was not real love. That was avoidance wearing love's clothing. I learned that legal documents are not things you sign without reading, regardless of who is asking you to sign. Thomas always said that. He was a landscape architect who worked with contracts constantly. He knew what legal language can conceal. I had known it too, but let the fear of delaying surgery override my judgment. That was an expensive lesson. I learned that community is not something built in a crisis. It is something built during ordinary years and only becomes visible when crisis arrives. Carmen had been my neighbor for 15 years. James had been my student for 12. The relationship built over morning coffees and weekend afternoons in the garden, and conversations that had no particular agenda. That is what held me steady when the ground shook. And I learned, or perhaps remembered something I had known for a long time and lost in the busyness, that this piece of land is not just land for growing plants. It is evidence of a life lived the right way, with your hands, with patience, with love for things that don't produce immediate profit, but produce lasting meaning. Thomas was right. A rose doesn't fear winter. It knows spring is coming. From April to October, I relearned many things I thought I already knew, but had only understood in theory. I learned to ask for help without feeling diminished by it. For 32 years of gardening, I had mostly worked alone. Not because I didn't want to share, but because I tended to think that asking for help meant something would get done differently than I intended. James and Carmen and Patricia and Micah and the others who came on that April morning showed me that was wrong. When people do something together, the result is not just the completed task, but something else and richer. I learned to keep records. Not in the way Thomas kept records of feelings and observations in his green notebooks, but in the more practical legal sense. Dates, events, exact words spoken, witnesses present. Margaret Chen taught me that, and I applied it during the evidence-gathering process, and it made a meaningful difference in the hearing. I learned to recognize uncomfortable truths earlier and not look away from them. That doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everything or questioning all things. It means that when something seems wrong, allowing yourself to acknowledge it rather than protecting the story you want to believe. And I learned, or remembered, since Thomas had tried to teach me this long ago, that the garden does not belong only to me. Not in the legal sense. Legally, it is mine. The deed says so, and the court confirmed it. But in the wider sense, that garden had been where 200 people learned to grow roses, where my neighbors looked out on every spring, where James Okafor began his love of plants and is now running his own nursery in Hillsborough. When I planted the garden again and opened Rose Garden Cafe, I wasn't just reclaiming what was mine. I was returning something to a community that had been part of that garden for 32 years. Build it to last, as old Patrick Callahan had engraved on his watch in another story from Chicago. Or as Thomas Whitmore put it in his own way, build something that can outlast one person, one season, one wrong decision. That is what I am trying to do. You now know all three of the secrets I held back in this story, but I want to recount them one more time in order because I think it matters to understand the complete picture. The first secret, I pretended to still be nearly blind for 2 weeks after my vision had started recovering. That is not something I am completely proud of. I am not someone accustomed to pretending, and it was uncomfortable. But in that situation, it was the only thing that allowed me to observe enough to understand the full picture before acting. If I had disclosed my recovery immediately, Diane and Brett would have changed their behavior, and I might not have gathered sufficient evidence. The second secret, the small phone Carmen gave me before the surgery. Carmen had been worried ahead of time. She didn't know exactly what would happen, but she knew enough to prepare a backup line of communication. That was the act of a careful and thoughtful neighbor, and it made a meaningful difference. The third secret: the 23 most precious rose plants delivered to James Okafor before the surgery. This decision I had made when I read Diane's notification about the authorization document 3 weeks before the operation and had the instinct that something was wrong. I didn't know exactly what would happen, but I knew those plants were something I couldn't afford to lose. The seed stock of a garden must be protected regardless of what happens to the garden itself. Those 3 secrets were not planned the way people plan things in movies. No flowchart, no numbered steps. They were small, separate decisions made by a 65-year-old woman who was preparing for eye surgery and sensed that something was off in her own home. Sometimes, the instincts of someone who has lived long enough are the best preparation of all. I am writing these words on an evening in early November, in the kitchen of my house in Northeast Portland, with a cup of tea on the table and a small yellow lamp and the sound of Oregon rain light on the roof. Through the kitchen window, the garden is in the darkness of an autumn night, but I know it is there. I know it is there in the way that a 32-year gardener knows, not by sight, but by an understanding deeper than vision. The roses are sleeping through the night, roots sunk deep in the damp and good Portland soil. Winter will come, and spring will come after winter. That is something that requires no argument and no proof. It is simply true in the way that very few things in the world are true in that sense. I want to say these things to you, not as lessons in the way people tend to offer them at the end of a story, but as the words of a 65-year-old woman drinking tea alone in her kitchen on an autumn evening in Oregon. First, the pieces of land, the gardens, the things people build with their hands over decades. They are not simply assets in the financial sense. They are evidence of a life lived in a specific way. When someone takes or destroys those things, they are not only taking money or acreage, they are denying the meaning of the time and effort and love that went into them. That is a serious act and deserves to be treated seriously. Second, never sign a legal document without reading it carefully. Even when the person asking you to sign is someone you love dearly, even when time is short, even when you are afraid or exhausted or under pressure. Find someone to read it with you. Find an attorney to advise you. Delay if necessary. A document signed in haste may take months and significant money to undo, and sometimes it cannot be undone. Third, good neighbors, loyal students, trustworthy friends. They don't appear in a single night. They are the result of ordinary years lived properly, with consistent kindness, by giving not only knowledge but attention and time, by treating community not as a network but as real relationships. When you need them most, they are there, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper. Fourth, the seed stock must be protected regardless of what happens to the garden. I don't mean only roses by this. I mean whatever matters most to you. Knowledge, skill, the real relationships, the values you have lived by. When everything outside is taken away, what is inside you and in the hands of those you trust, that is where you start again. And fifth, the last thing and perhaps the most important one for me, justice is not something someone gives you. Justice is something you must stand up and go looking for, with enough evidence and enough patience and enough willingness to face difficult things. It doesn't come quickly. It doesn't come smoothly. It comes slowly and sometimes painfully and not always looking the way you imagined it would. But it comes. In September of this year, in the rose garden coming back to life in Northeast Portland, the first blooms opened after 8 months of bare earth. I stood among the rows and looked at them. Deep red and pale pink and clean white, thin petals on firm canes. and I thought of the words I had said to Diane when she was 7 years old, slipping in the mud after a rainstorm and asking why roses have thorns. Because the most beautiful things still need to be able to protect themselves. That is still true. I understand it more deeply now than I ever have before. Justice may come late, but when it comes, it blooms brilliantly,